Thanks for being here. My name is Sean. I'm with North Branch Nature Center. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our Naturalist Journeys program series, the tail end of this year's series. We're running out of winter, so it's good that our winter series is wrapping up as well. And no better day to be talking about impact of climate change on our environment and our forests and our roads today. So thanks for coming out, and thanks for breaking the mud if you lived in the dirt road to get here. So a couple of quick housekeeping announcements. First, I want to thank all of our sponsors that make Naturalist Journeys possible. Thanks to our lead sponsors, Hunger Mountain Co-op and 802 Coffee, as well as all the other fine people you see up here with their nice fancy logos. We have one more Naturalist Journeys talk coming up next week. It's going to be not so much a talk as a musical performance by Ben Cosgrove. Any of you that are familiar with Northern Woodlands or just kind of the general environmental music scene, as it were, Ben Cosgrove is an amazing musician who composes piano music about landscape, and he's going to be presenting a performance all around kind of the intersection of landscape and climate here in Vermont. And there's still some space available in that program for next week, so please come. And let's see, so this whole series this year about our Naturalist Journeys series has been focused on climate change, but trying to approach it from areas and angles that don't often get talked about. And so tonight's program is no exception, learning about how carbon moves through forests, how carbon is sequestered and stored in forests, what the role is of forests in being carbon sequestration factories, as it were, and so all things forestry and carbon. I also want to just invite folks to hold your questions until the end. We'll have plenty of time for a Q&A afterwards. And then also after the program, feel free to stick around for a bit to check out the beautiful art gallery here and in the other room, our library in the other room if you haven't seen that before. So make yourself at home. And with that, I don't want to belabor any major long introductions, but Ali Kosiva is a forest ecophysiologist with UVM's extension program, former climate forester with the state of Vermont. And I was really excited to be able to partner with Ali to bring you here and bring your work to this audience. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ali Kosiva.
Thanks everyone for coming out. I was a little bit worried when I got here, or like barely managed to get here, that no one would show up. So I appreciate you all coming out tonight. So I am going to talk about forest carbon, how our forests help us mitigate climate change. So that's lessening the effects of climate change. I'm actually not going to talk about sort of the other side of the coin, which is how forests are impacted by climate change, but that is something I also talk about a lot. In fact, I just did a talk last week in Richmond for the Green Mountain Club, and I have recordings. And if you're interested in that, I can point you to some of my YouTube channel. But I'm going to really talk about forest carbon and the ways that carbon moves through forests. And I am a scientist. There are graphs in here. We'll warn you. I'll try to talk you through it, but that's how I approach stuff. I really approach it from, I'm a tree scientist, I'm a forest ecologist, so I really think about sort of this level and try to communicate it to the public and to landowners and folks that need this information. All right, so trees, they're amazing for a lot of things. They've been getting a lot of attention recently for their ability to mitigate climate change, which is really, they take in carbon dioxide from the air, from the atmosphere, and they use that carbon to make sugars that are their food. They use that carbon to build wood. And so that's the process of photosynthesis. And through this whole process, about half of the dry weight of a tree is carbon that was removed from the atmosphere. So you can share that little tidbit with your family and friends next time you see them. But really, it's a lot more complex than that. Sometimes it gets talked about like it's a stationary activity that the carbon comes into the tree and that's it. But really, it's this beautiful and pretty dynamic cycle, the carbon cycle that happens in the forest. Also, there's a global carbon cycle. And so that carbon dioxide is coming into those live trees, but really it's that carbon that is then moves throughout the forest as trees die. That carbon ends up in down wood. It can end up in the soil as leaves fall in the fall, or conifers drop their needles. goes into the litter layer in the forest floor, and actually trees can directly put carbon into the soil through their roots. Root exudates, fungi in the soil participate in that process. And what just happened was showing that at all of these processes, all these stops, there are emissions of carbon dioxide back out. So it's a really dynamic system that carbon is moving through, right? We're made of carbon. Every living organism on this planet has carbon, and we rely on live living plants and green plants to harness that energy from the sun and carbon dioxide to make it into something we can all use. And so everything in the forest is consuming that carbon to reproduce, grow bigger, all sorts of things like that. And so it's really a complex system. And I'll say that scientists are learning more and more about it all the time. And even you think we know everything about trees, we do not know everything about trees, and we knew much less about soil. And so we're constantly learning as new research comes out. We're building upon our knowledge on how this works. All right, I do have to do some terminology because this does get mixed up a little bit, so just to level set, because there are some new terms that maybe you've heard about, but carbon storage. So this is the amount of carbon in something. So you can talk about the carbon in a tree, you can talk about the carbon in an acre forest, or the state of Vermont's forest, or a cord of wood, right, of this building. You could talk about the carbon. The analogy I use, it's some money in your bank right now, today. A different term that gets used a lot and is helpful to talk about is carbon sequestration. This is really the process. So this is the process of taking that carbon dioxide out of the air and storing it. We're talking about the forest, but you can have carbon sequestration happen with sort of man-made ways that people are doing this. And so this is the analogy I use are deposits into your bank account. So that fluctuates, right? You might deposit more some months, less some months. The more you deposit, the bigger your bank grows. And then we have the opposite of that, which is carbon emissions. And that's a process of releasing that carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So those are like withdrawals. Again, they might vary over time. If you withdraw more than you deposit, your storage goes down. And so emissions happen very natural reasons. So one of them is the process that all living entities use. It's called cellular respiration. It's really metabolism. So that's a breaking down of those sugars and carbohydrates, release carbon dioxide. So green plants do that too. Even though they're taking in carbon dioxide and photosynthesis, when they use those sugars to make new cells or make flowers or do anything, transport materials, they then respire out carbon dioxide. And then things like decomposition happen. So this is the breaking apart of carbon molecules. As they get smaller and smaller, they can actually become soluble in water. So we have events like today, carbon's getting moved around the system because it's soluble. And then of course we have fire, combustion, and that's, releases that carbon dioxide back out to the atmosphere. It also releases methane, which is another greenhouse gas that has carbon in it. And so, you'll see on some of my graphs that I use this term carbon flux. It's really the combination of emissions and sequestration. We really want us to talk about when is emissions bigger, when is sequestration bigger? That's a good thing, right? And when is emissions bigger than sequestration? So it's really this balance because both things are happening in the forest. And we want to talk about when storage is growing or if storage is shrinking. So hopefully that is clear, but when I have some figures, you'll kind of see what I'm talking about. So when we drill down a little bit more, and I showed you that figure of carbon moving through the forest, we actually do talk about carbon in the forest in these what we call pools, and they're just like reservoirs. They're entities or parts of the forest that can store carbon, they can accumulate carbon, they can emit carbon. Really, the line between these pools is a lot less clear than what this diagram looks like, especially when we talk about below ground. You'll see this is divided into above ground live biomass and below ground live biomass. Really, that is just an entire tree. It's really how us scientists, folks that quantify carbon, there's different methods for quantifying carbon in each of these different pools. There's sort of different rates of accumulation and emission. So this is how we sort of break it up. When we have a managed forest, we do have another pool that exists outside the forest, and that's in harvested wood products. So when we harvest wood from a forest, some proportion, and it varies depending on what gets harvested, the species of wood, the size of tree, the quality of that tree, it goes into products that can store carbon for different amounts of time. So when we have wood that goes into, beautiful ceilings and, structures, buildings, furniture, that carbon is stored for as long as that product is used, which can be decades or, in Vermont, hundreds of years. We certainly have houses that are storing carbon for hundreds of years. If it goes into paper or, Amazon boxes, maybe not as long of a storage. So it really depends on where that wood goes and what the use is and how long people use it. And when we look at these pools, there are differences in how quickly they accumulate carbon and how much carbon they store. So on the accumulation side, most of this, so this kind of weird bluey green and this green are the live trees. So this is roots, this is above ground. If you combine that, more than 75% of the annual accumulation that happens in our forests is happening in trees. This makes sense. They're the ones that are taking in the carbon dioxide. They are growing bigger all the time. There might be new regeneration coming in the understory. But we do have quite a bit of accumulation coming in deadwood. That means that we're constantly having trees die or branches break, and we get a pretty sizable amount of carbon accumulation in those pools. In that pool, in the soil and the litter, those are really small. So that's basically showing that those don't accumulate very quickly at all. So they're basically, they're accumulating carbon, but they're also emitting carbon through decomposition. And so these pools change very slowly. If you look over at storage, the brown is more than 50%. That means that more than 50% of the carbon that is stored in a forest is in the soil. And that's really amazing. And we're learning more and more about that all the time. I will say, it used to be that scientists would measure only the top 10 centimeters of soil, thinking that was where the carbon was stored. And now we realize it gets stored much, much deeper in that, and that's where it gets stored for really long periods of time as well. And so storage in our live trees, it's a good chunk, but compared to what is stored in our soil. And actually the leaf litter, which you wouldn't think, you look down on it, you're like, oh, maple leaves that fall down every year, that's actually storing more. And this is average for Vermont forests. It's storing more than in our deadwood, which is pretty impressive. So don't underestimate litter. So we have these two, talking about the above ground, live, how that's below ground, lumping those together, that's the tree, the trees, carbon in live trees. And so one thing that I see get mixed up sometimes in talking about carbon is the difference between carbon in a tree and carbon in a forest. And it's actually quite different. And sometimes it gets really confusing when we talk about carbon. And I think that in general can be challenging when we talk about carbon, making sure we're talking about the same thing. And so this is one example, because carbon in a tree really does increase. We call this exponential growth, when you see a graph like this where it curves up. And so as that tree gets bigger, and this is showing data for sugar maple, we see more and more carbon accumulates in that tree. And this is really because trees, you can think of trees as this sort of three-dimensional entities. Every time they add a new year of wood, so every year they really have to grow, they have to add new wood every year to survive. There are some exceptions. They really can't survive very long without adding a new year of growth, because their ability to transport water is in that new year of growth. And so you can think about it like they're adding that layer of wood over every surface. So as that tree gets bigger, that amount of wood needed to cover that tree just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And you can also tell by this figure too that that 40-inch sugar maple just takes up much more space than this 10-inch sugar maple. And so that relates to when we talk about the forest. So when we see forest carbon, we actually get a line that looks more like this, right? So this is, again, we're just talking about the carbon in the live trees, and this is showing forest stand age, which is a little bit different than I showed before because it was the size of the tree, not always correlated, but the concept here is that when you have a young forest, regrowing on an old field, you have a lot of little trees that occupy that space. And this is really key that I'm showing it by area. So it's an acre, right? And so as you progress in this forest, as forest develops, not all those trees can survive. You can't have all these trees mature, there's just not enough space. So some of them die, and they're really growing rapidly to out-compete each other. And so you see that the peak point of accumulation is around this sort of middle age of a forest. And as forests develop, you have fewer trees, but they're going to be larger trees, and you have more dead trees, you have more complexity. And so we generally see this pattern of increased storage as forests develop, but that rate slows down, and that's that sequestration. And of course, this does continue. On 2 slides I have that, I guess. So I'll show you what it looks like for what we know for old growth and old forests in the region. Because this ends at 125, but certainly forests are much, much older than that. And so when we look at this by the different pools, so you can see this is what I was just showing you for live trees. This is storage. And these are the other pools. They look like they're not really accumulating, but it's just because there's sort of a slower rate than the trees. But the general pattern across all the pools, as forests develop and get older, all of those pools increase. And you can see that in the total line. And then this graph on the other side is flux. So anything when we have a negative number denotes that there's net sequestration, net accumulation. And so what this is showing is that, again, that sort of like peak time of rapid growth, when that stand is young to middle age, is when that peak sequestration happens. It still continues. It's not that older forests don't sequester carbon. It's just at a lower rate. And that's reflected again on sort of the slope of that line. And we do know, we have some old growth forests and some old forests around this region, that these patterns continue. And so this is from 20 forest stands. They're not all technically old growth in that they were never affected by logging or impacts of humans, but they have various ages. And so this is showing average. If I showed individual plots, they'd actually be quite, scattered all over the place, but we put the average together and model them out. And this shows how that trend continues, that we have accumulation of carbon as that forest gets very, very old, and that this flux, so again, this is still sequestration because it's a negative number, but it's getting less and less. It's approaching 0, but not getting there. So we still see the old growth forests can remain what we call a carbon sink, which means they're sequestering carbon. There can be forests, and I'll talk about this, that are emitters of carbon, and that can happen at any age, really. So the things that impact this pool, the live tree pool, really is, comes down to the age of trees in the forest, their size, their species, the density. And so this is showing that there are differences in storage and flux sequestration by the forest type. And these are very general patterns. Not every forest is going to align with this, but it sort of shows in the gray, this is oak hickory, just stores a lot more carbon than other forest types. When we look at sort of the lowest one here, this light blue spruce fir, sort of makes sense if you've been to a spruce fir forest up on Mount Mansfield. Trees are a lot smaller. They're not quite as big as a glorious huge oak tree, and so they just store less carbon overall. But the general trajectory and patterns are pretty universal. And then we see what affects the changes in forest to forest carbon. Environment is really important. So I mentioned Mount Mansfield, cold place, thin soils, short growing season. You're just not going to get as much carbon stored there as down in the Champlain Valley, right? Because the length of the growing season, the amount of time that tree has to photosynthesize. And then things that affect sort of like mortality of trees, disturbances and stressors. So we have a lot of these. These can affect the carbon storage, the sequestration rate, whether a forest is an emitter of carbon or a net sequesterer of carbon. And so, you know, these are general patterns that we talk about across a lot of plots going into these data points, these graphs, and their models. But when we look at an individual forest, there can be a lot of variability in the carbon, and that's natural, and that happens. And so really we know that our forests, they're driven by disturbances of various intensities. So a little windstorm might knock down a few trees, or a big windstorm, a microburst might knock down a whole stand, right? So we have all of these things that can happen, and they can cause these, oh, I need a little pointer, these little, this is showing partial disturbances. They can cause a decline in stored carbon. And then you see this recovery, and you can see a lot of different trajectories. And you know, one thing we have not been able to follow a forest for hundreds of years. We just do not have that data. And so we don't know the individual dynamics of a forest over 500, 1,000 years. It's just not something. So what we do is we take forest stands right now that have different ages, and we put them on a graph, and we assume that that's a pattern that will follow. And so, you know, it's just something that we're, again, learning more and more about as we gather more data and have more research. And so we see that we can have these two types of forests for very, you know, natural reasons, for anthropogenic reasons. So we use these terms, you've probably heard, and I've mentioned them a few times: carbon sink, net absorber. So that's when sequestration is greater than emissions, and a carbon source is a net emitter of carbon dioxide. And that's when emissions are greater than sequestration. And so things like a windstorm knocks down a lot of the living trees. Suddenly that forest is not photosynthesizing at the rate that it was prior to that windstorm, and now has a lot of dead trees. And as those trees slowly decompose, they emit carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. So this is going to change the sort of balance of sequestration for emissions. Things like this is maple leaf cutter, pretty minor issue in our forest, but it affects the leaves, which is where photosynthesis happens. And so when we see a big outbreak, you know, we usually see that those trees don't grow much that year. And that's showing us that sequestration is pretty low, and the trees recover fine. Of course, fire is a big one, and we're seeing states out west, and certainly Canada this past summer, are net emitters of carbon dioxide, their forests, because of wildfire. And then when we do something like harvest timber and wood products out of our forests, we are removing carbon. So that does change that dynamic. I mentioned it does depend on what happens to that wood and how much gets used, the efficiency, and so that gets a little bit complex, but we are, you know, removing carbon from the forest, so that carbon stored in the forest does go down. And so this gets to this sort of really tricky part about carbon, that there's two really important things. It's space and time, and it's hard to, you know, talk about carbon now when we think about carbon in the future and carbon on this one forest versus carbon on a landscape. And so you can imagine, say we have this one forest, the carbon might look pretty dynamic over time. So maybe there was a windstorm that knocked down some trees, and so the carbon stored in that forest declines as emissions go up from decomposition and photosynthesis went down. Maybe there were an insect outbreak. Maybe there was a drought, right? And so we look at a longer time frame, and if we average out that, we see that actually that stand increased in carbon. But if we looked at that short time frame, we'd say that that stand lost carbon. And sort of similarly on the landscape, maybe this is all going on in this one stand, but at another stand, another forest, it's not having that same dynamic. And so what we do see when we take a bigger view is things sort of level out a lot more. Unless we have something very, very catastrophic like the 1938 hurricane, which we did not, no one computed carbon dynamics from, but I imagine it was a significant loss. Looking at some of the other pools, deadwood, I mean, I love trees, so I can't pick a favorite, but I really love deadwood a lot, and I hope that you all, when you're walking in the woods, start looking at deadwood a lot more. I think probably most of my photos are either live or dead trees on my phone, but so deadwood is really, really important in our forest. It's also important from a carbon standpoint. Ecologically, so much biodiversity, fungi, microbes live and rely on deadwood, not to mention all the mammals and birds that use them for cavities, for nesting and whatnot. And so we see that deadwood has this sort of, again, these are modeled on different forest types. You can see how they're sort of like wavy influx, and those are that's showing flux, not storage. And just to illustrate that deadwood comes sort of in these pulses, right? We always have little branches that break every year, but when we see accumulation of deadwood, it happens, there was a windstorm, there was some mortality event that caused, a bunch of trees to die. And so we have this sort of pattern where we get these pulses of deadwood that come over time. And you can see that's showing, again, there's differences by forest type, and that depends on how frequently those trees die, what their lifespans are, because we have different ages of trees in our forests, and so we'll have different deadwood dynamics. So this pool is really affected by rates of tree mortality and disturbances, but also on the flip side, how quickly decomposition happens. And so decomposition is really affected by the climate, and that's one thing here in the Northeast. Why we have deadwood in our forests and why we have a litter pool is because we don't have a growing season year-round. If you go down to places like the Amazon, where there is a year-round growing season, decomposition happens so much faster. So in the winter, things are really pretty much stopped, and so that's why we get more of a buildup of these deadwood pools. And things like, what the decomposer community is. Really, it's mushrooms are the main driver of decomposing wood. They're really the only organism that can decompose lignin, which is really, really hard to break apart. And so mushrooms come in and they break apart that wood. What the site conditions are like is really important for how quickly that happens. And of course, then just things like how big was a piece of wood and what species was it. So generally, bigger deadwood is better, lasts longer, can take decades to decompose a big tree. We do see things like conifers tend to decompose slower than hardwood trees. There's some variability there, but like a hemlock is going to decompose slower than a birch. And so we get different dynamics depending on the species composition and the size of those trees. I did mention the litter pool already, how cool it is and how it stores quite a lot more carbon than we would probably give it credit for. This is showing carbon storage in the litter pool by different forest types, and again, just showing that there are differences by forest type. So our winner here is the spruce fir forest, and actually that had the lowest live tree carbon, but it has the most carbon stored in the litter pool. And that's because if you think about that forest type, it has that really impenetrable layer of spruce and fir needles. And where these forests exist is often cold, high elevation spots that just have a really short growing season. And so you get a lot of carbon built up in that litter layer. And so this is really affected by how much litter is getting deposited every year and the species. But then again, this really important part about decomposition rates. And so some leaves decompose faster than other leaves. That depends on where that site is, what the climate is like, how much moisture is there, what's the temperature, the elevation. And then we see things like anything that causes disturbances that cause mixing of litter can affect this pool. And this is really important when we think about the floods that we had this summer and I guess this winter into December, right? We had a lot of, if if you walked in the woods, and this is something that I have my eyes trained towards, and I was looking around, but I saw a lot of litter moved in the forest, right? It was a lot of what we call overland flow. The soil was saturated, the water tables were high, water didn't have anywhere to go, so it goes over the forest floor. It moves this litter layer, especially, of course, we have mostly steep terrain in Vermont. And so we see that can affect, the ecology of the forest, because that litter layer is important for protecting the soil. Then you think about, okay, what's the consequences for the carbon? I don't know that we know the answer to that. But just really interested to see how much litter got moved in the forest, and it gets moved downslope, potentially into our streams, maybe even further into our, lakes and ponds. And the other thing that's really interesting and of growing concern is earthworms. So all earthworms are not native to our region. They were all removed, the last glacial period meant that no earthworms survived. So all earthworms we have here came from Europe, or more recently came from Asia. And they're good in the garden, right? We like them in the garden, but one of the reasons we like them in the garden is because they churn through organic matter really quickly, and they release nutrients really quickly. The problem is our forests weren't adapted to have earthworms, so what we're seeing is that nutrient pulse is happening too quickly, really, and that litter layer is getting decomposed by those earthworms too fast, and it is affecting the ecology of our forests. Probably my biggest concern is on, understory plants, not as much the mature trees, but sort of seedlings that have a shallow root system. And then things like, can't really see here, but like spring ephemerals, sort of herbaceous plants in the forest that can get more affected by that impact. But something, again, people are studying more and more and trying to learn about. So the soil pool, as I mentioned, is really amazing, but we are learning a lot more about it over time. So really, it's incredible how these papers will come out. It's like everything we knew about the soil pool is wrong. And so people are learning a lot more about how deep that carbon can get stored, how it gets stored, how it gets into the soil, actually. And so some cool things. This graph this map of the world is showing the age of soil carbon, the mean age of soil carbon. And carbon can exist in the soil for days, but it can also exist, up almost where we are, it's like a few thousand years, right? So we can have carbon that gets stored for millennia. That doesn't mean all the carbon does. Some of it will get churned over really quickly. But just a really interesting pool. And that really what we see is that soil carbon is really related to a latitude, which is really related to climate, less so than the trees. So this blip here is showing the Amazon, rainforest, right, that has a lot of carbon stored in the trees. Yeah, there's a decent amount of carbon stored in the soil, but not like when you get up into, really Arctic, subalpine areas where you have a lot of carbon stored in the soil. And a lot of that has to do with those cold climates. You just get accumulation of carbon. Think about a peat bog. Peat bog is a lot of carbon because that decomposes very, very slowly. You can have, feet or, many, many feet worth of peat that accumulate faster than it gets decomposed. And so this pool is really affected by soil respiration. And so I mentioned that all living things respire, so all the living things in the soil also respire. And there's a lot of living things in the soil. There was a recent paper that came out that said there is more, there are more organisms in the soil than there are above ground, right? So there's so many different life forms that folks are still discovering, right? Arthropods and springtails, and there's bacteria and viruses and nematodes, fungi, all sorts of things we collectively call the soil biota. And so they're doing a lot to, sort of break apart bigger pieces of plants. So as plants die and wood starts, breaking apart, they then eat that. They'll also then, they die and something eats them, right? And so it's this really complex process that creates the long-term carbon storage we can see. And so part of it is the process of all these organisms consuming carbon gets it to form into different aggregates. So it actually becomes more stable over time. Not all the carbon, some of it gets churned through very quickly, but it can form these aggregates that can be stored in the soil, like I said, for decades, centuries, or longer. And so, when we think about what impacts the soil pool, anything that really causes soil disturbance. We thought for a long time that things that were on the surface of the soil, so equipment, would impact the soil pool. It's pretty stable. What really impacts it is anything where we're sort of churning up and mixing the soil together. So any equipment, tilling is really, really destructive to the soil carbon pool, and that's one of the reasons why you hear in agriculture there's a move to no till agriculture. There's other reasons for that, but it's sort of maintaining that soil structure. And again, as I mentioned, earthworms, we're seeing some big impacts on the soil pool. So to look at, there's this recent really awesome paper. I love this scientist, Luke Nave, of the Forest Service, and he did this big meta-analysis. And like I said, we're learning a lot about soil carbon every day. This just came out a couple weeks ago, and it's a meta-analysis. What that means, he took all different research and sort of pooled it together to look at patterns, and was looking at change in soil carbon based on different land use changes. So looking at what happens when we have deforestation to development, when we have deforestation to agriculture, so when we're turning forests into those other types, when we have forest harvesting, and when we have reforestation, so when we actually convert developed areas or ag land to forests. And what we see when we do reforestation, you get an increase in carbon in the soil, right? Forest harvesting is found, so that's 267 research papers that he looked at, had a very minor impact on the carbon in the forest. And again, that's just because it's really stable under the ground as long as there isn't sort of a tilling. And this gets to sort of a climate connection because loggers really rely on cold, frozen ground to limit that impact to the soil. When we have conditions like this, makes limiting those impacts a lot harder. And what we see is that, a big one, I was really surprised at how the magnitude of this carbon loss when we convert forests to agriculture. And it just really shows that, that intensive change of land use, but also that tilling of the soil, the big impact that has. All right, so Vermont's forests. This is what our forest carbon looks like. So again, these are those same pools as I showed you earlier. This goes back to as long as we have data that we can look at for carbon across Vermont. And so these come from, we have a network of plots throughout the state that the Forest Service has set up on all states. And they're permanent plots. They do not release the location of them. So they're very secretive, but they release the data, which is great. And they are sampled on a rotating basis. In Vermont, we have about 1,400 plots measured every 6 years. So a subset of them are measured every year. And we can do things like look at the carbon in our forest and look at how it's changing over time. And these data are really good for sort of statewide assessments to be able to pool all those. So what we see is over time, our forests are a carbon sink. They are accumulating more and more carbon. And this is accounting for loss of forest from land use change. This is accounting for forest harvesting. This is accounting for everything that's happening in our forests is reflected in these plots. Because sometimes these plots get converted into development and that gets factored into the analysis. And so this, if we, for some reason, not saying this is ever going to happen, but if all of our forests were lost, that's equivalent of 175 years worth of our state's annual greenhouse gas emissions. So those are greenhouse gas emissions from heating our buildings and driving our cars and industry in the state. We have a greenhouse gas analysis for the state. We're about 8 million metric tons. And so this is equivalent to 175 years worth, which is pretty cool. So we gotta keep our forests. When we look at flux, so again, this is sequestration, our forests are carbon sink, which is great. You know, most of that's coming in our live trees. We do see that this rate is decreasing. So remember, bigger negative numbers are more sequestration. So since the 90s to about today, we're seeing this rate has slowly declined over time. It's equivalent to about half of our state's emissions, which is great. We don't have a huge population in the state, and we have a lot of forest, so this is pretty good. When we look at some other states, they're, you know, a lot different than that. You know, Massachusetts and Connecticut, only, you know, it's like less than 10%, I think. So that's great. And when we think about some of the state's goals to get to net zero, we can, you know, it seems very feasible that we can get there if we lower greenhouse gas emissions. So why is this happening? Well, again, I showed these graphs. This is overlaying our distribution of our forest age in Vermont. So this is showing, you know, that we have, you know, most of our forest is sort of in this 50 to sort of 100-year age range. And so as our forests age naturally, they just are going to naturally sequester at a slower rate. They're going to continue to store, so we're going to see that storage increase, but that rate of sequestration goes down. And so it's just something that we need to factor in, again, of those goals. By 2050, we want to be net zero. Well, we need to account for the fact that sequestration today is not going to be the same as sequestration in 20 years based on these patterns. And this isn't, you know, anything new for us. In fact, you know, we had a huge pulse of carbon emissions from our forests early in the 1800s, back into the, you know, earlier than that, and certainly well into the early 1900s, when most of Vermont was cleared of its forests. So we see that, you know, this was a lot of emissions from our forest ecosystem. We did have some of that carbon go into wood products, but the majority was emitted, and really a lot of it, you know, forests were burned after they were logged, right? So it was very destructive. A lot of carbon was lost in that process. So I mentioned wood products. Right now, I've done a carbon inventory for our state. And right now, we do have a benefit from our harvested wood products that store carbon. It's really, really hard for us to track this because we don't track every timber harvest and what products get made from those and where those products go. And another issue is that we don't account for wood imports. So what does that mean for our state when we talk about carbon? But we do see, based on the data I could get, you know, we have a contribution that harvested wood products do accumulate. And again, I mentioned that it depends on what product they become. And so what's interesting in this, you know, certainly paper, you know, doesn't last long. So this is showing how the fraction of carbon remaining after, you know, a certain amount of years. So after 20 years, paper is pretty much not storing carbon. You know, some of the paper will go into books, but the majority is going to be short-lived products. But then when we have different products, what I think is pretty interesting, this blue line, is oriented strand board, which is OSB, which is used for flooring and sheathing. Anything that goes into a building is going to store that carbon much longer. And so when we calculate the carbon of our harvested wood products, you have to know what product did it go into, what was the efficiency, how long would that have been used, and so it gets really complex pretty quickly. And so we see now, after this big pulse of emissions that we had from land clearing, then we had land abandonment or farmland abandonment, and our forests are a natural cover in most of Vermont, so forests just regrew, trees regrew on those areas, and so we had this period of sequestration, which we are still in. So the power of our forest right now is partially, we're partially benefiting from this land clearing because we're still in that period of really rapid growth. We're still accumulating more forests that are being abandoned. And so we see that we could go some different trajectories depending on land use decisions, depending on climate change impacts, but we're really in that sequestration period following abandonment. What's the time? Oh, okay. All right. So what we do see though now, after all of that, we are experiencing forest loss now, and in Vermont is the same. It's happening throughout the region. We were a little later than some of the other states in New England, and it's really hard to get a good estimate of how much forest land we're losing every year. I mentioned those plots by the Forest Service are one estimate. We also have satellite data, but it's really hard for us to quantify this in a great way. And it varies from year to year. And so we're losing anywhere from 4,000 to 12,000 acres of forest land a year. And I computed what this meant for carbon using data from 1990 to 2019. And so this is all the different states, and here's Vermont here. So the blue is land that was converted from forest into something else. So these are emissions above the zero line. And then the green are areas that maybe were farmland or some other type of land that we're allowed to convert back to forest, usually just because people sort of abandon them. Not necessarily, very rarely are they planted. It's usually that they're allowed to regrow as forest. And you can see that it really varies between the states, and then this number is the net. And we are a net positive number, which means we've emitted quite a lot of carbon from land use loss, from forest loss. And this is equivalent to about 3.5 years of our greenhouse gas emissions. Granted, that did happen over a 30-year period, but we're losing more forest than we've gained. And that's different depending on the states you're in, right? Connecticut actually is net gaining forest, and they have a negative number here. So that means that they are having more sequestration than emissions and land use change. And this is only showing forest, not wetlands or grasslands or other type of land that could be changing in land use. All right, I did want to briefly talk. I've sort of seen how much time I had because I don't want to go on too long, but I was going to talk a little bit about strategies we can use to think about forests and their carbon benefits. How are people doing as far as their good? Okay.
Keep talking.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So and these are sort of like broad strategies, and I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of like pros and benefits and considerations about them that we can do in our state. And so, number one, avoiding deforestation as much as possible. Right? As I mentioned. Of course, this keeps carbon where it is. It also maintains that future sequestration benefit. So every acre of land that we lose from forest, we're sort of chipping away at that bigger forest ability to help us mitigate climate change in our state. And then, obviously provides us with other things like reducing fragmentation. So what's really important in a changing climate is that species are able to move, migrate to new locations. They have a hard time doing that if forests aren't connected. And so this is really important when we think about sort of our state and our biodiversity. Oops. But, like everything, there are considerations that we need to make. It's costly. Land costs are a lot right now. And then we think about, we do have a housing crisis, right? And so how are we thoughtful and recognize there might be places that we are going to have to lose forests, and we're okay with that, but maybe we're really intentional, and there's certain places that we're okay, instead of having, what we are having a lot is the longer driveways and the breaking apart the forest in different places. And then of course, thinking about what does it mean to be permanently protected from that change. And so these are just things as we think about things like 30 by 30 and other state level planning, especially when it comes to carbon, we have to think about what this means. Another strategy, and you might have heard a lot about this, is planting trees. So the like 1 trillion tree project, which is a national project, and a lot of different countries have different tree planting efforts. And the idea here is really planting trees for carbon sequestration. And so this is a tool you can go explore on Reforestation Hub, and they've mapped out using really complex spatial analysis of what counties around our area could have more trees. And they did take out prime agricultural land because that was really a concern of like, well, we need food. But you see, I mean, Burlington and sort of Franklin County, Grand Isle could support more trees. And certainly like New York has a lot of opportunities for planting trees. And so they quantify this and they say, you know, if we planted 5 billion trees in this region, so this Northeast region, New England and New York, it would capture 34 million metric tons of carbon dioxide per year, which is about, it's around half of what these states' forests sequester every year. So it could sort of like increase it by 50%, which is pretty impressive. I will say there's some considerations here. So it is great, right? Net gain in carbon sequestration. Trees are great, especially in, you know, where people live. They provide shade, they provide habitat for wildlife, they block wind, they have great, you know, all these other services they provide. It doesn't shift resource demands, and this is this term leakage. I'll talk about what this means in the next slide. But there are some serious considerations that are tied to this tree planting effort that are sort of coming out as people are like, yes, let's plant 1 trillion trees, this is great. Well, it costs a lot, and you need people to do it, and you need people to maintain these trees. There's a really high rate of failure. 50%, you know, give or take, of planted trees will die. It takes a time from planting a tree for it to provide these carbon benefits, and it has to survive to do that. So that's one thing. It's not an instantaneous benefit. And then again, too, we have land use trade-offs, right? So we don't want to be taking area that we grow food on or we need for other uses. We really have to be thoughtful about what does this mean? What are our considerations with how we're using the land? So market leakage is this really, you know, economic concept that I didn't think as a scientist I'd be talking so much about, but I now know as I've gotten really into carbon and sort of the dynamics of it and how closely tied to our resource use and our demands and all this stuff is really important, is this concept of, you know, it'd be great if we could say, hey, let's do nothing to our forests. We're not going to harvest timber here. We're going to, you know, keep all of the carbon we have, and that'll be great for us in Vermont. But meanwhile, like, there's never going to be a day we don't need resources. And what it means is we're an affluent part of the world. We're going to be importing products from elsewhere. So that either means we get wood from elsewhere or we get other products. And right now, there is no more sustainable, carbon-friendly product as wood. And so this has been like a journey for me too, as like, you know, thinking back to me as like an 18 that would have just, didn't understand the benefits of having this, you know, a local wood economy, sustainably harvest. And so it really means that if we do that, if we just push our impacts elsewhere, it negates those carbon benefits that we would like to have here, because we're either going to transport them farther distances, that carbon will still be lost in the forest. And we often don't recognize sometimes that has really, you know, unintended consequences to the people and the organisms that live there. We can't see what's happening, right? So it's, you know, this happens a lot when we think about, oh, we're going to get our food from elsewhere. And it's like, yeah, but if we get it from a local farm, we can go to that farm and see how those vegetables were raised, you know, those animals were raised, and see how those vegetables were grown. And so, you know, it really does, we really have to think carefully. Again, this is just like the complexity of this problem, is that everything has a trade-off. And so this is an important term, market leakage, when we think about carbon. Another great strategy is designating reserves. And so we've called this, another term is passive management. A sort of recent term that's come about is proforestation. It's really the same idea. Proforestation has sort of put a carbon lens on this idea of reserves, but it's really the same idea, is like protecting forests, keeping them intact, and not extracting resources from them. And so this is a strategy to sort of maximize carbon storage. It's not guaranteed. There could be disturbance in that forest. Climate change could affect it. An insect outbreak could happen. So it doesn't guarantee carbon storage, but it's sort of like that's the goal. I really think it's a great strategy in addition to carbon. A lot of people are hanging their hat on this for carbon, but really it's, preserving old forests. Of course, any place we have sort of, rare, uncommon, unique features, natural communities, certainly for biodiversity. And I also really advocate that it can be applied at a range of scales. So when I work with landowners or foresters, say, hey, can you create a small reserve here? Can you make sure, can you keep this area in perpetuity, right? And so it could be a tree, it could be a stand of trees, it could be a whole parcel. But some considerations for this strategy is it's not going to be a good fit for all forests, depending on their conditions. I'll talk about that. And when we think about climate change, there are some reasons that this might not work to advance sort of the resilience and adaptation of that forest stand to future conditions. And again, talking about leakage, and it's not going to be a problem if we designate reserves here and there. It's this idea of, if we suddenly said, oh, all of Vermont is going to be a reserve, right? There's going to be some serious leakage implications that might not have the benefits that we were hoping to have. And so another aspect of this is this land use history component we have. And I really recommend, I think this is Vermont and New England is very interesting to sort of unpack the land use history. Tom Wessels, if you're familiar with, he has a Reading the Forested Landscape book and Forest Forensics. It sort of gets into these, what happened here? What was the land use history? How can I sort of unpack what's happening? We do see that, depending on what happened in that forest, there are a lot of documented examples, and from research we know this, that we've had reduced species diversity. We have reduced age class diversity, so a smaller range of ages in our forests. We have things like this photo behind here, which we call old field white pine. It's just white pine that grew up in an old field, and they're really close together. They have really small crowns, really easy to topple over in the wind. We also have things like invasive species that in some places like that forest in the top are sort of covering the understory, which means that they outcompete our native plants and our native trees. And so this is being seen down in the mid-Atlantic. It's very worrisome. Something will come through like emerald ash borer, which kills ash trees, and it's killing the overstory trees, but the understory is just invasives. And so this forest then transitions for who knows how long into an invasive shrubland. It's no longer a forest, right? Because it didn't have that smaller age class to sort of take over as a natural, as a forest would. This is another example. This is in Bolton, where I live. This is down on the floodplain of Winooski. This is all invasive goutweed. Again, there's no regeneration there. That forest, I'm very worried. It's also just a strip of forest. It's really tiny. It's hard for forests to exist. So, when we see forests like this, their carbon will fluctuate a lot. They're going to go through sort of these boom and bust cycles of carbon. And these are opportunities, I think, for coming in with a little bit more of active management to sort of facilitate development of these forest conditions. Another issue we have, this is showing, can't really tell, but this is a fence here. And so this is on this side of the fence, it's all ferns. There are virtually no seedlings or saplings. On the other side of the fence, which keeps out deer and moose, there's sort of a density of saplings, a lot of different species. And this was set up as an educational display to show how pervasive animal browse is on our forest composition. We're not going to be able to, fence off big areas, but just to show, we do really have a high deer population, and they like some species over others, like sugar maple and oak. And we do see in some forests, you might not recognize there's been a deer herbivory problem, except that there's just nothing on the understory. This is a great, I love this researcher, Kate Miller, who's at the National Park Service. She's based out of Acadia, and she does a lot of work on regeneration, and she mapped out sapling density. And this gray hatched area means that there's insufficient saplings to take over the overstory. And we're in, much of Vermont is in just the next category, which is the orange. And this says nothing about the species, just the number. And then, when we think about climate change is bringing a lot of stresses to forests. It also acts as a threat multiplier for things like insects and fungal diseases. This is Hemlock-woolly adelgid, invasive plants, certainly, overland flow, as I mentioned, and heavy rain events. And so, there is concern that these could bring more disturbances and then carbon losses to some forests that may be more vulnerable. And we're already seeing this, actually, this was an interesting article showing that we're seeing an increase in tree-killing pests, and then those are releasing so much carbon, essentially increasing that impact of climate change. So the next category to talk about, I think there's 5, so this is the 4th one, is this idea of using ecological and carbon-focused forestry. So this is active forest management. It can be paired with passive management. Like I mentioned, you could have areas of reserves. But thinking about using active management as a tool to enhance these characteristics of forests to create, to restore them, maybe if they have been degraded from past land use, to create opportunity to improve resilience. And the idea here is that you can sort of remove maybe diseased or slowly growing trees, give room to healthy, vigorous trees. You can transfer carbon to the other pools. So one thing I advocate for foresters and loggers to do is create deadwood, to actually intentionally fell and leave trees. Even some loggers will push over trees and leave the root ball up, which is really cool. Girdling trees, that means cutting through the tree only a little bit, leaving it standing, but it slowly dies. And this idea of that there are different ways to enhance some of these components of a forest, and it does help with carbon. And so this idea of resilience is something I think about a lot, and it's the ability of a forest to recover or adapt following disturbances or stress. And this is something that forests have done for millennia, right? They constantly are experiencing disturbances, and they recover. The concern really is if some of them are in a state because of past land use, because of past human decisions that people made, they don't really have that resilience. Maybe they only have one species. Maybe they don't have an understory of smaller trees to take over. And so we know from research, we can see that there are sort of generalized characteristics of resilient forests. Diversity is really, really key. This term we use is called structural complexity, sort of this idea of messiness in our forests. And this is against some of our cultural practices we've had in our forests that Vermont, landowners in Vermont were paid to clean up wood, and often still I hear this from landowners want to tidy their woods and want to make it look good. I'm like, nope, leave, unless it's blocking a trail, leave it. Deadwood is great. And so, thinking of trees of different sizes, ages, gaps in the canopy, right? We have this condition across Vermont that we have very similar forests throughout Vermont, whereas historically, before land clearing, we would have had forests in a lot of different conditions because they just would have been in those spots and experienced different disturbances. And so we call this landscape homogenization. It just sort of means more similarity. And so thinking about ways to make our forests messy and different. Things like regeneration and processes that are well functioning, specifically hydrology, which has been affected by past land use. If you walk in the woods, you'll see evidence of past logging roads that, it's before time when folks knew where, we had sort of the science to understand where a good place to put a road is and how it should be closed out after it was used. And so these are sort of these ideas. Not every forest is going to be different, right? But these are sort of guiding principles when we think about resilience in our forests. And so, we know from research that complexity and diversity are related to better carbon benefits too. So it sort of is a twofer, that we get better resilience and potentially forests that can adapt to these changes, but we also get carbon benefits. So this is work by Dominic Tunt and Bill Keaton at UVM, and they looked at a huge number of plots and sort of tried to parse out what factors affect carbon. And one of the things is this structural complexity. They did see that was related, because you just have more structural complexity, which means you have more going on in that forest. You can sort of pack in different sized trees into that space. Of course, when we talk about active management, I mentioned this, when we're harvesting wood, we're doing anything, it's going to result in carbon losses. And so this is a hard thing to communicate, right? We might want to have some carbon losses in that forest for a long-term trajectory of better carbon benefits, resilience. I use this term resilient carbon, meaning that, if that forest is going to say it's healthy, it's resilient, that carbon benefit will be also. And of course, it's, really site-specific. And this is something that I think in general, there's no one-size-fits-all strategy for any land. It really should be based on the conditions of the forest and sort of a careful reading of what's going on the land. And the last strategy is, thinking about harvested wood products and what we can do in this realm for increasing carbon storage. And so, as I mentioned, it can potentially be a long-term carbon storage. I should say that potential. We do get some greenhouse gas benefits if we use wood over some other products, like, for example, there's a Maine company making wood insulation, which is really cool, in that if it's replacing plastic, polystyrene, whatever, long name, if it's replacing a fossil fuel-based, insulation, that's a win, right? And even when we use it, over steel I-beams, you may have heard of mass timber, which is massive pieces of wood. If we can use them over steel, very intensive to make steel and transport it. And we do get some benefits for our local economy, for our rural economy, and some sort of like sovereignty of having, the ability to make our own resources, and having that be sort of a little bit more circular would be cool. Of course, a big consideration, actually costs a lot more to work with wood. I have a friend that's an architect in Seattle, and she did a mass timber building, and it costs so much more money than if they had done steel, which is really disheartening, because, at the end of the day, luckily the client was for it. It was for a university, but, they have to sort of be motivated. As I mentioned, the benefits of wood really depend on the efficiency and what it gets used for. And so that's sort of really hard to track when we think about carbon. I have already mentioned that timber harvesting is always going to increase emissions relative to no harvest. And then one thing that I struggle with a lot is that in our greenhouse gas accounting in our state, we really ignore anything we buy from outside the state. So again, we could stop harvesting completely and just buy all of our wood from New Zealand, the Amazon, and that wouldn't affect our carbon budget, which is a really tough thing to work with. And it's just something we all, there's no great answer to it, but it's something we need to be really careful and intentional about, that we're thinking about. One of the terms I use is, what does the atmosphere see? And so when we think about carbon benefits, if we're harvesting wood from elsewhere, the atmospheric impact is the same, maybe even worse with the transportation distances. And so that's a really helpful way to think about these impacts, not just what's happening in our state boundaries, but what's happening to the atmosphere, because that's really the important part. So just to end with this, I love this quote. This is by Paul Catanzaro, which is my counterpart at UMass, and Tony D'Amato, who's a forestry professor here at UVM, and both great folks, great scientists. And this is the document that they wrote really for landowners. But I just love this, it's this idea of trade-offs, right? That there are many benefits that forests provide. Carbon is one of them. And so when we think about managing for carbon, I really encourage folks to manage for carbon and other things. If we just manage for carbon, there could be some unintended consequences of that. So we really need to be holistic and think about sort of how we, what resources we use, how we need the land, and sort of balance all of these different needs, which, I do not have the answers to that. I'm just providing the science. So that's for, state planners to figure out. So that's what I got. I just wanted to end to say I did bring some Northern Woodlands magazines back there. So this past year I wrote a series on forest carbon. So please take them. If we run out, you can go to the UVM Extension Forestry website that I have, which is this QR code will get you there. You can just Google it. It's the only one. And all the articles are free as PDFs. And so check those out. And this coming year, actually just came out, I'm doing a whole year-long series on climate change impacts to forests. I also have lots of other resources on the website. So if you're bored, if it's rainy, mud season, you're stuck at home, check it out. So thanks everyone and I'm happy to take questions. Yes, first question.
How do you measure the amount of carbon that's either being stored, sequestered, or emitted?
Yeah, great question. So we actually mostly we measure it by how much is stored, and then to figure out whether it's emitted or sequestered, we take the difference between two time steps. So I'll give you an example. So in a tree, we want to measure the carbon in a tree. That's actually the easiest pool to measure. We measure the volume of that tree. So we measure its diameter and its height, and we use these equations that are based on species and location, and we get the volume. Well, then we have to convert it to weight. So we do some more equations. So this just shows there's actually a lot of steps where inaccuracies or sort of like generalizations come in. So we convert that tree into weight because we need its mass to figure out how many atoms of carbon are in there. And so, that depends on the species. Each species has a different mass. So, like some species are really heavy and some are a lot lighter than others. And so those have different amounts of carbon. If you pick up a piece of wood and it's really heavy, that's a lot of carbon versus like balsa, which you probably all, or birch or something, it's really light, less carbon. And we generally assume that wood is 50% carbon. So we divide that mass by half and we get the amount of carbon. And so to measure change in that tree, whether it's sequestering or emitting, we then take another measurement a year later. It's actually better if you do sort of 5 years later or some other point. We measure the diameter, measure the height, then do it again and calculate the difference. There is another way to measure sequestration and emissions, and that's these fancy flux towers. So Harvard Forest has one in Petersham, Massachusetts. I think that's the closest one. There's one at Duke. Basically, they're these really expensive sort of like towers. I don't know how, like fire tower kind of looking things with lots of equipment on them, and they measure what the air is seeing. So this is actually a little bit more accurate way if we think about what does the atmosphere see. They're actually up above the tree canopy, and they measure sort of carbon going down at the forest and carbon dioxide getting emitted. But they're really expensive. We don't have that many of them, so we have to sort of use other data to sort of fill in. And I mentioned trees are the easiest. It's really hard to measure carbon, even in a dead log. If you think about like a dead log, it's like part of it's rotting. It might be weirdly shaped. So it gets harder for us to measure that accurately. You hope that if you take enough plots, so this is part of like the scientific process, that it's, you get a level of variability that you're comfortable with. Soil, we'll say, is very heterogeneous. So it means that like from one point to another, you have to take a lot of samples to get an assessment of the carbon in soil. How it measure, you take it back to the lab, they actually burn it, combust that soil, you measure the carbon dioxide that's in the gaseous form, and then that's how they do that. But you need a ton of different samples, and then I mentioned like, well, how deep do you go, right? Some of our soils go down meters. And so that adds a lot of complexity to our forest. So yes, we have numbers to put to carbon. Always sort of like refining them and getting them better. But it's really, really labor intensive and costly to measure carbon in a forest with precision, I would say. So it's hard. Yes, I don't know. Shelby, yes.
I had a question about one of your tables. You showed like the carbon in Vermont forests over time and the carbon pools, and you said that it was there was less, it was declining over time. And to me, it looked like the block of that chart that was getting smaller was the soil carbon, but your next slide was that the forests are getting older and that it's about the forest age. And so I'm curious, how are those things related? And I was always under the impression that older forests tended to have more carbon. So I would think the soil pool going down would be more related to things like conversion in agriculture than forest.
So that wasn't that the forest carbon pool was going down, it's the rate of accumulation every year was going down. So it's so that it's just not accumulating as much carbon every year. I mean, there could very well be a climate implication to that too. We do see, I mentioned, so when I was talking about the soil, that really clear tie with decomposition rates and climate. Latitude is what we use for that, but like climate. And so we see in warmer climates, we have faster decomposition. That is one theory of why we're seeing less accumulation over time. But it's also that, we still see that carbon pool, the soil carbon pool growing, but it's just that rate that it changes. I will say that most of the data we get from old forests, old growth forests, I showed the Bill Keaton work, it's just live trees. So we don't really know a lot about carbon in these older forests, and so perhaps they do get to a point where they're just not yes, that soil pool is getting bigger every year, but that magnitude is getting smaller. We just don't know. And is there, all these other factors that get into more rain that we're getting, right? We can see that we're getting leaching of carbon. I mentioned that from the soil. So yeah, it's complex for sure. Yeah. Yes.
The science and the graphs and how we look at change and at the realities that are in front of us are very interesting. But what I especially appreciate is your description of complexities. I can't tell you how many times I felt totally alone in the world looking at areas where I think, this is going to a shrub layer. And I've never heard anybody talk about that before. And it's really, these are the complexities of our life today and all the things that are going on in a forest. And then there are other wonderful forests that are obviously going to withstand that sort of trend. But yes, I appreciated what has this been, an hour? You were able to really make me feel like a normal observer.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that feedback. That's amazing. Thank you. I think behind you is first. Yeah.
15 years, or maybe a little more, I read an article about the sequestration. There was kind of a debate that it had always been believed that the young trees sequestered faster. And then this was a researcher from the Northwest somewhere. Yeah. And she was saying, well, man, that might not be true. The old trees are also sequestering, maybe even at a greater rate. Where's that debate these days?
Yeah, so I'm not exactly sure. Well, so one of the things is the tree versus forest. So we do know that old trees, they do, right, adding that layer of wood every year. And so I do a lot of tree ring science, so dendrochronology, which is taking out these pencil-sized cores. And you do see this, like, that bigger trees, which are usually the older trees, not always, they are, they have to put on, even if they put on one cell's worth of ring, in that ring, it's still a lot more wood than when they were this big, right? And so that might be, because there has been a bunch of that in the scientific discourse of tree versus forest. And so certainly we do see big old trees, especially they're often taller. The tallest ones in our forest, they may have really big canopies, so they are collecting a lot of sunlight. They have really big root systems, access to a lot more resources than maybe a tree that's under that canopy and is really getting sort of suppressed. And so that is something we see. But when we look at sort of the forest level, we see this natural pattern. And it's really, like I said, there can be any one stand can sort of do its own thing. When we look at sort of the aggregate over time and sort of figure out that trend, we see that like older forests are going to sequester at a slower rate. But older, right, what younger is for a forest is really what a lot of our forests are right now. Younger is like anywhere, it depends on the forest and location, could be from 25 years to like 80 years, right? And so I think what people hear for young, they're thinking, oh, that's like a seedling, sapling forest. Well, no, it's actually not. It's what we have a lot of in our, that look like a mature forest, but on a forest time scale, that's still a young forest, because a lot of our forests, a lot of our tree species can exist for, 400, 500 years old. So that's just a blip, teenage. Yeah. Did you have a question?
I did, it's still good for us to nurture trees in our own lots and plant new trees, protect them and keep them going as much as we can. And I mean, how do you, from an individual level, say, go plant your 100 trees, or
if you have space, like plant trees, or support your community planting trees right in open spaces. I mean, they're great as a windbreak. I think we have a lot of opportunity, I think, to increase our tree cover, even in Vermont, even with 73% tree cover. I see areas where like edge of field, let's have some trees there. That could be a windbreak or snow break, or provide shade for animals, or certainly in our more built areas, they're really important for a lot of those kind of services that they provide. So that's great. I'm all about planting trees. It's again this idea of like, no one strategy is going to be a panacea. It sort of takes all of them to get us where we want to go, and being really thoughtful with that, and I think is important. But yeah.
I noticed that this audience is, I wonder how many people here are younger than 60. Did you raise your hand? There's one. Okay. Yeah,
I got some.
But it just breaks my heart that I know that you probably teach a lot of young people about forestry and stuff, but I just wish that you couldn't like get out of high school without knowing this stuff.
Oh yeah, I mean, even my whole life I've known about climate change. I mean, it was called global warming, but it's been my whole life that it's not been a time I can't remember a time not knowing about it.
But knowing specifically about forest ecology and these issues. The carbon issues.
Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering, tying right to what was just talked about, planting trees. Is it better to let a field go through natural succession for structural complexity rather than just one species? It kind of.
I think so. I think it's way easier and cheaper. For the most part, our forests things will naturally seed in. The issue might be
invasives.
Yeah, invasives we have there, or just lack of a seed source. Mm-hmm. And so if stuff isn't coming in, then resorting to planting. But if you're going to plant, try to get a variety of species would be great. Even planting them maybe clusters and then space, sort of a little bit less of rows, like a plantation. Yeah. There are these, what are they called? These like tiny forests that people are doing, but they're planting trees with shrubs too, and really, thinking about it's not just trees that make up a forest, right? And yes, if you have the trees over time, other things will come there, but
I would just think if the conditions are right, letting all that natural succession go, all that complexity would be really
and that happens, if you have, and they don't even have to be that close. You'll get the seeds that can travel by wind, the small seeds, birches, white pine, you'll get them, cherry, you'll get them pretty quickly, and you will get this, you can sort of see this succession, and it really is, it's going to be a lot less work. Planting is a lot of work, and like I said, it's surprisingly not that successful.
Yeah.
And another thing I should mention too, it's just really hard to find like native trees to plant out around here. A lot of, you can get them for sure. You can get a sugar maple, but you might not be able to get sort of some of the less common species. And that's just because if you think of it, like nurseries really have for years really supported sort of horticulture and people planting for certain reasons, or even in the forestry world, planting for like timber value versus sort of biodiversity and ecology and stuff. And so it's actually a really big issue that folks are realizing. As a researcher at the University of Mont P. Clark is looking in this, and like nursery capacity is just really limited for a range of species to plant out. And when we think about climate change, there might be times where we sort of want to plant species that might be what we call future climate adapted. That means that we think that they might be more adapted to the future conditions. And so that's like getting a species maybe from a little bit south of us, here.
Like
might
more
be
oaks or something?
Yeah, exactly. Oaks and hickories, pines are really some of those. So getting, species that come from southern Vermont and moving them up. I've actually started doing that in my woods as just getting acorns, because there's red oak just down the valley, the Winooski Valley. So I've been popping them in the woods, and yes, a lot of squirrels get them, but it's been a pretty low cost option. I'm just trying to get a little bit of diversity in my forest. But yeah, so that's a challenge too with planting. So I really, most landowners who are doing this, they've had better success with going out and collecting like hickory nuts and acorns and planting them, because it's just hard to find them as nursery stocks.
But we also have a wild turtle to worry about. If you don't plant, you're going to get wild turtle anywhere in the road.
Or buckthorn.
Yeah.
Buckthorn everywhere.
Yeah.
But wild
Invasive.
turtle if you're in the road.
Yeah.
And it will take over.
Right.
the whole
So
field.
invasives are really can make that different.
We should wrap
Yes,
up.
great,
Maybe we
thank
can do one more question, and then or if there's any, I don't know how many are pressing, maybe we can just take one more, and then we can let folks come up and ask
Okay,
other
yeah.
questions.
Well, in the end, we talked a little bit about resilient forests
Mhm.
and doing things like opening tree canopy and doing things to address, because what we have are forests that are largely the same age species-wise. So how much active management for resilient forests do you promote? Because that's sort of a questionable thing. You take a healthy forest, you start knocking trees down, open holes in the canopy, things like that.
Well, so first of all, it's really like assessing the forest condition and that need. And so this is something I do have a resource for landowners, sort of thinking about vulnerabilities and things they can do to enhance resilience. So if you have a really beautiful, structurally complex, species diverse, it has regeneration, it has all those things for resilience, like that's not the best spot for that kind of work. Really recognize that we need resources, using active forest management as a tool to enhance resilience and to restore forests. So, it's hard in our landscape in Vermont. It's amazing. We have so much private forest land, but that does mean we can't be as strategic of like what we do where, right? And so, so I just encourage landowners to really, get to know their land, get to know the features, go out with experts and walk it and sort of like identify, oh man, this is a really special spot I have over here. It really, has a lot of these features. I'm going to create a reserve around this, but maybe over here where this was old pasture, it's white pine and red oak and that's it. This is an opportunity to do some work, and harvesting timber is a way to pay for that work to happen. That's one thing that is really important for a lot of landowners, is that to do some of this restoration, to like fix old roads, to remove invasive species, it costs money. And so selling timber is a way to make that, actually happen on the landscape. It's one of the reasons like timber prices are really not great right now. It's sort of undervalued as like a resource. I would love to see, like we have with local food, like, oh, if you manage your forest ecologically, you get more, your wood goes for a higher price. I would love that, and we're not that. It's like, it doesn't matter if you harvest a red oak here where you clear cut it versus over here where you did this great management. They go for the same, unless it's a different quality of tree. you don't get, and so we just don't have that system that, you're like organic farm, like, and so it gets really challenging, but that's the fact of the matter is like to get that work done is often that important trade-off to do that, and you can
What
be
about
providing.
cordwood though, like so many people burn to eat? I mean, what's the impact of that?
Yeah, cordwood, I guess we should wrap up. I can talk to you.
Yeah, why don't we take that one
Yeah.
up front, and you can come huddle with Susie now
Yeah.
if you'd like to know about that. Allie, thank you so much
Yeah,
for
thank
your
you.